I'm going to jump right in because I have a lot to say because this is a really exciting, interesting topic. So since many people in the room know me primarily in my administrative role, let me briefly reintroduce myself as a scholar. As Tony mentioned, much of my early and mid-career research focused on developing comparative methodologies for indigenous literary studies. In particular, I am known for juxtaposing American Indian literatures, other expressive arts, and activism with indigenous literatures, arts, and activism from Aotearoa New Zealand, Oceania, and Australia. My current project, however, is rooted firmly in native North America. With the working title, Earthworks Rising, each of the 5 chapters builds from contemporary artists, writers, performers, and communities, engagements with indigenous mounds and other earthworks, and with what we might call earthworks principles, such as alignment, integration, convergence, and duration. But before we go further, you may be wondering, what exactly are earthworks? To which I may be tempted to respond, where have you been all these thousands of years? The compound word earthworks evokes the obscured, eroded, desecrated, dislocated, too often destroyed, and occasionally reconstructed mounds, embankments, and other earthen structures, such as level plazas and raised causeways, built across the eastern half of the North American continent between about 500 and at least 5,000 years ago. Its internal juxtaposition, vital earth, dynamic works, suggest a synthesis of artistry and engineering. These are massive projects in applied science, staged as ceremonial complex, social forum, sports or civic arena, marketplace for objects and ideas, artistic workshop, open-air theater in the round, square, or octagon. Several distinct types of mounds remain wholly or partially visible in a range of sizes and shapes, although often in altered or deteriorated conditions. These sites of worked earth suggest the multiplicity of their original functions, and they suggest the extent, purposefulness, and complexity of indigenous interactions with land and engagements with technology, sometimes singularly and within remarkably short intervals of time, but also cooperatively among diverse nations and over multiple generations. The ongoing presence of earthworks in North American landscapes, monumental, well-engineered, aesthetically exquisite structures, intricately planned, mathematically and geometrically encoded, and multiply aligned with waterways, with bluffs, ridges, and other natural features, and with the visible patterns of the moving cosmos above, reveals the false premises that undergird settler fantasies of having discovered a so-called new world untouched by human hands or human minds. Like many of the writers and artists whose works I study and with whom I collaborate, I have a personal as well as intellectual interest in mounds. My family is from South Central Oklahoma, and we are descended through my mother's line from Chickasaw who were forcibly removed from the ancestral homeland in the Southeast. Like other Southeastern peoples, the Chickasaw were builders of mounds. In addition, I completed my master's degree at Washington University in St. Louis, across the Mississippi River from Cahokia, a huge earthwork city built about 1,000 years ago. More recently, before moving to the University of Washington, I was on the faculty at The Ohio State University, as Tony mentioned. And like that of the Mississippi, the expansive valley of the Ohio was one of the major regions for the construction of earthworks, burials, effigies, and large geometric enclosures between roughly 2,000 and 500 years ago. My embodied experiences among mounds have been important influences on my scholarship. One of the arguments I have been making is that, in addition to their functions as art, engineering, and urban design, earthworks should be understood as forms of indigenous writing, systems of signs aligned into systematic patterns, systematic encodings of knowledge through indigenous technologies and practices. Indeed, I've been arguing that earthworks can be understood as forms of encoding indigenous knowledge, not simply on the land, but literally through the medium of the land itself. And I've been arguing that, as a consequence, Our reading of mounds cannot rely exclusively on semiotics, a deciphering of signs, but must also involve embodied practices and the full range of our senses. My new manuscript is arranged into 3 sections, each aligned with a primary category of earthworks: effigies, platforms, and burials. A key organizing concept: crossing worlds, networking systems, and gathering generations. And an aspect of spatial positioning: above and below, the cardinal directions, and center. For our time together this evening, I'm going to focus on the 3rd section, burials. Chapter 4 of the new manuscript juxtaposes a sequence of interrelated earthworks poems by Allison Hedgecoke, a writer of Cherokee, Huron, and Creek descent, with a series of interrelated earthworks photo collages and assemblages by Alyssa Hinton, a multimedia artist of Tuscarora and Osage descent. Through this focused conversation among diverse productions, the chapter explores how burial mounds are conceived by these indigenous artists and intellectuals not as sites of loss and absence, as they have so often been depicted in non-native representations since the 18th century, but rather as sites of regeneration and renewal. Hedgecoke's book-length sequence, published in 2006, animates an extensive earthwork site located on both sides of the Big Sioux River on what is now the border between Iowa and South Dakota. As at other earthworks complexes, the mounds at Blood Run were built to serve multiple civic and sacred functions, and they were designed to align with natural features in the landscape, such as rivers and bluffs, to align with each other, and to align with discernible patterns and movements in the sky world. Moreover, their designs and alignments were based not only in precise observations of the natural world and cosmos, but also in symbolic languages and systems of abstract notation, including mathematics. Hedgecoke simulates these multiple, simultaneous alignments in her precise positioning of Blood Run's 2 narrative and 64 persona poems within numbered sections and within the sequence as a whole. She also simulates these alignments by repeating a set of standard units of measurement, the natural numbers 4, 3, 7, and their multiples, as well as the sequence of the first 24 primes, those natural numbers that can be divided only by themselves, and the number 1. In addition, Hedgecoke's embedded alignments manifest in her precise numbering of lines, in her precise patterning of stanzas per poem, lines per stanza, words per line, even syllables per word, and crucially, in how these multiple numerical configurations align further with specific content, with wordplay, allusion, and imagery, also with building themes. One such theme is the gendered and productive nature of burial mounds. In the series of 64 persona poems that comprise the main body of the sequence, Hedgecoke enables 37 distinct elements associated with the Blood Run site to speak. The poems thus function as a script for embodied or imagined performance. Some of the personas speak only once in the sequence, often in direct conversation with the persona on the facing page, while others speak multiple times. Those that speak more than once include the collective voice of the mounds, which speaks 7 times across the sequence, as well as the individual voice of burial mound, which speaks 3 times. Both personas emphasize the mound's gendered potential for creation. In her first appearance, for example, positioned as poem 7 in section 2, Origin, Burial Mound describes her body of layered soils as a venter, an old word that can indicate the swell of a muscle, suggesting the mound's inherent strength. But venter can also indicate a swollen belly or uterus, suggesting a state of pregnancy, and through its multiple meanings, linking the mound's pregnancy to physical strength rather than vulnerability. More directly, venter can also mean womb or mother. In her third appearance, poem 14 in section 3, Intrusions, Burial Mound then describes her outer surface as a seed coat, hull, and testa, that is, as a seed's protective covering. In the poem's final line, She describes herself explicitly as a productive womb. There's much more to say about the poem, but here I will note that its macro structure of 17 lines, the 7th prime, arranged into 6 stanzas, is condensed in the final line of 7 syllables, the 4th prime, arranged into 6 words. Moreover, the central positioning of the comma creates a caesura, a dramatic pause, signaling an intake of life-giving breath and affecting the lines epitomizing juxtaposition. Without my womb, they but dust. The 7th and final appearance of the collective persona, the Mounds, is positioned as poem 7 in section 4, portend, again emphasizing an alignment of 2 of the sequence's basic units of measurement. The poem's 27 lines are arranged into 9 stanzas, emphasizing the sequence's other basic unit of measurement, 3, through cubing and squaring. The poem is further arranged into 13 statements. 13 is the 6th prime. These mathematic encodings create meaning at the structural level of the poem, and they create multiple alignments with additional poems in the sequence. As the final articulation of the collective voice of the Mounds, the poem summarizes the earthwork's primary functions, asserting civic, ceremonial, elegant effigy, snake. Our purpose is funerary, fundamental, immaculate. In its suggestion of purity of purpose, immaculate responds to the dominant culture's damning of indigenous imagery, perhaps especially of snake imagery, as pagan and unholy. Moreover, immaculate carries the specific connotation of the Christian concept of the Immaculate Conception, linking to the assertion made throughout Blood Run that burial mounds function as earthly wombs for the honored dead, as portals appropriately prepared for shepherding energy across worlds. Significantly, this role is articulated at line 14 in the 5th stanza, the poem's fulcrum, where 13 lines and 4 stanzas are balanced above and below. Here, at the poem's center and effective navel, in 7 words, the Mounds assert as one of their primary functions the literal rebirth of their indigenous makers. All will know our great wombed hollows. As I was arriving at these conclusions about the gendered functions of Mounds in Blood Run, I came across Alyssa Hinton's evocative collages that also center burials. Hinton describes these works as mixed media composite. Although they are created with photographic, digital, and other visual media rather than spoken language or alphabetic writing, Hinton's creative process has much in common with Hedgecoke's. As Hinton explains, the process involves the piecing together of photographic elements with original hand-rendered art and digital editing to create a hybrid art form. Moreover, she states, it's like an elaborate refinement process where layers of meaning filter through to convey a story. Hinton's layering of image fragments to create narrative meaning resembles Hedgecoke's aligning and realigning of multiple poetic elements to animate Blood Run, to enable the site to speak its own story, rather than be spoken about or for. It was Hinton's 1998 photo collage, Ancestral Plane, that first drew my attention. Assembled from 33 image fragments, Ancestral Plane depicts a burial mound overgrown with grass and trees, not as a site of death, colonial nostalgia, or raw material for archaeological careers, but rather as a site of indigenous rebirth and regeneration. I was immediately drawn to the vibrancy of Hinton's palette, to the purple, blues, and orange. But I was also drawn to Hinton's bold reclamation of the dominant culture's convention of representing burial mounds in cross-sections. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians create these cutaway perspectives in photographs of excavations in progress, as well as in drawings, diagrams, and other illustrations, and sometimes in 3D scale models, in order to expose the hidden interiors of mounds. These depictions typically reveal multiple distinct layers of rocks and soils. Some also reveal multiple layers of distinct mound structures, that is, smaller mounds constructed at earlier periods and now set within larger mounds built over them. As expected, most include one or more distinct layers of funerary objects, other cached objects and raw materials, and human interments. The 3D scale model on display at the Serpent Mound State Memorial's Interpretive Center provides a dramatic example. Built in the 1960s, this cutaway cross-section diorama of a conical burial mound is presented in a limited palette of dull browns, pinks, and grays, and is set behind glass within an otherwise bare display case that creates a stark foreground and background. We might characterize the setting as clinical, even sterile. The burial is presented in complete isolation, devoid of relations with any aspect of its surrounding environment. This is an obvious contrast to Hedgecock's elaborately situated and elaborately aligned burials in Blood Run. The cross-section exposes multiple layers and multiple types of interments beneath the mound's surface, and thus makes available a complex but easily discernible narrative of original burials and constructions, followed by successive burials and constructions, and at least one intrusive burial. Through its multiple layers, and through its figures of bare skeletons and human bodies in multiple stages of decomposition, the 3D model offers attentive viewers a sense of mastery over the mound's elaborate history. Similar to Blood Run, Ancestral Plain offers a striking contrast. Unlike the dull diorama, removed from its surroundings and situated within a sterile environment, Hinton positions her vibrant mound within an equally vibrant setting. The middle ground depicts a radiant field of grasses in vivid tones of golden yellow and pale orange, immediately adjacent to the mound, while the foreground depicts a radiant field of wildflowers in rich tones of pink and fuchsia. These luminous fields extend behind the mound where they meet the horizon. Above this line, the background depicts radiant clouds and misty white bleeding into higher clouds in a glowing red-purple. These clouds nearly fill a still discernible blue-purple sky. Set within this dramatic sky world is the kinetic figure of a dark bird, outlined in white, wings pulled back, legs extended in descent. Similar to the vibrant field in the foreground and radiant cloud-filled sky in the background, the mound itself emanates light and color from within. Although the mound's uneven surface is strikingly dull, and although this surface is overgrown with weeds and 2 trees in leaf, a cutaway exposes the mound's brilliant interior. Unlike the crisply cut cross-sections of archaeological models and diagrams, the opening's edges are more organic, reminiscent of puzzle pieces, or perhaps the edges of continents. The interior is thus only partially revealed, and the opening's irregular edges suggest movement. Like continental plates, the surface of the mound appears to be in motion, slowly breaking apart to reveal its contents. What viewers see exposed by this cutaway is a cross-section of funerary objects, other buried materials, and human interments set within vivid layers of soils, as well as dark roots outlined in white, extending into the layers from the 2 trees growing on the surface. The mound's base is a deep red soil with yellow and orange highlights, the layer nearly filled with mostly indistinct remains in pixelated blacks, blues, reds, and whites. There may be human interments, but if so, they are no longer distinct. They blend into the shapes and colors of funerary objects and other materials. Above this dark base, a middle layer glows in pixelated golden yellows. 2 distinctly human interments glow as well, but they are neither the bare skeletons nor the realist decompositions depicted in the 3D model. Rather, the interred bodies glow in pixelated multicolor, shadings of whites, oranges, yellows, and blues that form organic shapes. Together, these shapes and color gradations suggest the shaded contours of digitized maps, geographical area maps, and topographic contour maps, but especially evocative heat maps. Lying within layers of packed soils, the interred bodies are themselves depicted as animate landscapes and active sources of heat. hidden reservoirs of life and energy. Above the middle layer of interment, between the radiant landscape bodies and the dull surface of the mound, centered within reddish soil among additional funerary objects and the living roots of trees, Hinton has placed the figure of a human embryo. In contrast to the interred landscape bodies, which lie on their sides in repose, the embryo sits in an upright fetal position, its head facing left toward the descending bird. And where the ancestors produce light and heat in multicolor, the embryo glows a dark electric blue, outlined in black and haloed and pixelated white. It too is a vibrant source of energy. Situated in the layer of soil above that of the radiant, heat-generating landscape bodies of interred ancestors, the electric blue embryo is a vital sign of the mound's function as a womb, a productive source of new life. In her artist statement, Hinton describes Ancestral Plain as the cross-section of a burial mound, breaking open to reveal remnants and remains of cultural relics and people. Trees draw upon these vestiges for sustenance, while the embryo also is fed to support its new life, reawakening, rebirth. The hawk, able to see the unseeable, is the messenger of change landing, reminding us of our potential. In this gendered and indigenous account, similar to Hedgecoke's poetic accounts, the burial mound is more seed than sepulcher. When conditions are appropriate, the surface breaks open seemingly of its own volition, like the shell of a bird's egg that first cracks, then slowly breaks apart as new life emerges from within, rather than be broken into from the outside by desecrating looters or archaeologists. Through this revelatory movement, the mound reunites upper and lower worlds. It becomes a portal linking generations, including the living and the dead. And it appears that it is the sheltered seed, represented in the figure of the electric blue embryo, which seems to float within nutrient-rich, perhaps amniotic soil, that offers contemporary indigenous communities the power to rebuild their worlds, and thus the potential to rebuild their lives anew. In the vibrancy of her composite image, Hinton not only reclaims the practice of archaeological cross-sections, she reconceives that dominant scientific practice in distinctly indigenous terms to serve distinctly indigenous purposes. The dull-colored 3D model freezes the body of a mound at a particular stage of invasive excavation and freezes the interments at particular stages of decomposition, all of which is depicted as located firmly in the past and as isolated from ongoing natural, human, or other than human processes and forces. In contrast, through the precise use of radiant color and multiple suggestions of movement, Hinton's photo collage depicts both the body of the mound and the bodies of interred ancestors as active and changing. These vibrant bodies are connected to multiple worlds, including natural and spiritual worlds, and distinctly indigenous futures. Now, initially, I focused my attention on the electric blue embryo positioned above the mound's heat-generating and topographic ancestral remains. Why, I wondered, does Hinton color this figure blue? Can a blue embryo signify something other than distress? My first thought was that the coding of the embryo as blue suggests a code blue medical emergency, when a patient requires resuscitation because of respiratory or cardiac arrest. The most obvious interpretation seemed to be that the embryo signals the ways in which indigenous cultures and technologies are in need of revitalization. But as I studied the image, I came to realize that the blue coding may link Hinton's arresting depiction to the provocative work of Anishinaabe writer and intellectual Gerald Visner, who often evokes the idea of an indigenous blue radiance or blue power of creation. In his 1991 novel, The Heirs of Columbus, and in other works across multiple genres, Visner codes native survivance, survival understood as active, creative presence, as blue, or even more suggestively, as blue transmotion, creative movement that crosses realms, including between the material and the spiritual, the living and the dead. As Hinton suggests in the overall vibrancy of Ancestral Plane, earthworks are a category of creation to which humans actively relate to each other, to non-human animals and other aspects of the environment, to the spirit world. The electric radiance of the blue embryo appears directly connected to the glowing topographic and heat maps of the interred ancestors. What the dominant culture so often codes as red and dead, Hinton, similar to Visner, codes as blue and as multiply alive and creative. Hinton's specific choice to position the embryo in an upright fetal position, facing left, reminded me of a well-known image from the 19th century, which depicts a large burial mound in the process of elaborate excavation. My memory was that I had seen the image reproduced as illustration in several print publications, and I had also seen multiple versions circulating on the internet. Some displaying the scene of excavation in full, but many cropped to display only the cross-section of the mound. As I searched for information about the image and its provenance, I learned that although it is often displayed or discussed on its own, it is actually part of a much larger set of painted scenes, 25 in total, that depict the Mississippi Valley at multiple points in history. Moreover, I learned something that is not readily apparent when these scenes are viewed as book illustrations or as digitized image files. The originals are enormous in size, on the scale of scenic backdrops painted for a theater stage, and they are literally connected, part of a single canvas. Indeed, the 25 images comprise a massive panorama that measures 7.5 feet tall by 348 feet long, painted in tempera on a continuous roll of cotton muslin. Titled Panorama of the Monumental Grandeur of the Mississippi Valley and produced by the Irish-American artist John Egan in or around 1850, the elaborate series of painted scenes was commissioned by Montroville Wilson Dickinson, a Philadelphia physician and amateur archaeologist who had excavated a number of Mississippian mounds between 1837 and 1844. Based on Dickinson's notes and sketches from the field, Egan created the series of 25 vignettes depicting dramatic, idealized river views and quasi-historical events, including idealized events of exploration and discovery. Once completed, the massive panorama served as backdrop for Dr. Dickinson's traveling lecture about his explorations of Mississippian landscapes. For its time, the huge muslin scroll, which was wound and unwound on rollers, represented the latest in educational technology, an early form of a slideshow or PowerPoint projected on a massive screen. By all accounts, Egan's panorama and Dr. Dickinson's live lecture, augmented as well by a, quote, cabinet of Indian curiosities that supposedly included 40,000 relics collected from 1,000 mounds, were extremely popular with their 19th century, presumably non-native audiences. Positioned as scene 20, the image of elaborate excavation featuring a large burial in cross-section is probably the panorama's best-known vignette. Typically titled Opening a Mound, similar to Hinton's Ancestral Plane, scene 20 depicts a burial overgrown with trees. The cutaway perspective, which, also similar to Hinton's photo collage, features organic-looking edges around the opening, reveals a cross-section of multiple layers of soils as well as multiple layers of funeral objects and human interments. As already noted, the cutaway mound is often cropped when used as illustration, and is this version that I most remembered having seen. Egan's original, more complex vignette, however, is worth describing in detail. In the center foreground, a well-dressed Dr. Dickinson is depicted in the act of writing notes about the excavation in progress. He stands beside another well-dressed white man, presumably in conversation. Toward the left edge of the mound, Dr. Dickinson is depicted a second time, now in the act of sketching the excavation. It wasn't enough to have him in there once, he had to be in there twice. Beyond the edge of the mound to the right, another well-dressed white man and a small group of well-dressed white women observe the scene of discovery from a short distance. Some of these figures direct their gaze toward the surrounding scenery. Most striking, however, are the figures of 8 African-American men spread across the central foreground. In contrast to the well-dressed white men and women, the African Americans wear work clothes, shirt sleeves rolled to expose muscular forearms, and they are depicted in neither intellectual nor leisure pursuits, but as wielding shovels and pickaxes in the hard labor of the actual excavation. As several scholars have noted, Egan's muslin canvas exposes a racialized division of labor. But this is no generic scene of excavation, as some accounts written by art historians and literary scholars suggest. Rather, it is the specific event of Dickinson's 1843 excavation of a mound located in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, on the plantation owned by William Faraday. One of the white men likely represents Faraday, and the laborers are not simply African Americans, but Faraday's slaves. Stated plainly, enslaved black bodies marked as muscular perform manual labor in the service of free white bodies marked as intellectual in order to unearth indigenous bodies marked as ancient, skeletal, and dead. This account of the scene's racial dynamics is complicated, however, by what is depicted in the extreme right-hand corner of the vignette's foreground. Here, under a canopy of tall trees and before a set of pitched tents, a small group of American Indians gathers in separate conversation. Two men in robes and feather bonnets flank two women who recline on the ground, one holding a swaddled infant. None of the Indians directs his or her gaze toward the excavation. Positioned at the far edge of the scene, the Indians are typically omitted when the image is cropped, even when the excerpt includes Dickinson, Faraday, and the black slaves. Nonetheless, the group of Indians, their disinterested presence located literally at the edge of scientific modernity, would appear to authorize and perhaps to legitimate the scene's violent act of exposing indigenous ancestors for non-native purposes. We might note further that within the larger vignette, the small configuration of contemporary Indians is counterbalanced at the extreme left of the foreground, not by a similar configuration of white directors or black laborers, but by an expanse of unoccupied wilderness. It is unclear if viewers are meant to equate the Indians with the untamed land, or to read the vignette chronologically from left to right. That is, from a state of wild nature, nothing to see here but swamp and trees, to an example of a lost civilization, the cutaway mound and its revealed skeletons and clay urns, to the Indians' contemporary state, exotic in feathers, but self-contained and marginalized, cut off from modernity defined by scientific inquiry and the white oversight of black labor. In either account, living Indians are of little consequence to the central triad of directing and observing white bodies, laboring black bodies, and dead indigenous bodies rendered as intact skeletons and scattered bones. A visual empathy between opening a mound and ancestral plain is most apparent in each work's central figure of a cutaway burial in cross-section. Set side by side, the photo collage echoes the vignette painted almost 150 years earlier. The digital image removes the African American agents of excavation, as well as the white directors of that enslaved labor, the white spectators who observe the mound's destruction, and even the living Indians sequestered at the extreme margin, replacing these elements with vibrant grasses and colorful wildflowers. But the stratigraphy, the order and positioning of layers revealed in Hinton's cross-section, echoes the stratigraphy revealed in Egan's, and either updates or repurposes those layers in significant ways. Dickinson took detailed notes of the stratigraphy of the mounds he excavated, and no less than 5 distinct layers comprise the elaborate cross-section in Egan's painting. At the base is a layer of dark soil and rock, in front of which sits a large clay urn, its surface decorated, its interior filled with protruding human bones. Additional bones lie scattered across the exposed ground. The second layer is a reddish-brown soil filled with human interments and small clay pots. 4 full and 2 partial skeletons are visible, laid flat on their backs, heads oriented to the left. The third is a more vibrant, golden yellow soil with no interments. The fourth repeats the reddish-brown soil and is again filled with human interments in small pots. 4 partial skeletons are visible, again on their backs, heads oriented to the left. The top 5th layer of the cross-section repeats the golden yellow soil and is filled with 2 decorated clay urns. In contrast to the single urn set before the bottom layer, these appear empty. The mound's surface is overgrown with grass and trees. In addition to the 5 distinct layers of soils, the cross-section exposes a vertical shaft dug from the top center of the mound through the top 2 layers and into the 3rd. The image thus depicts a typical excavation strategy of the period. A shaft was often cut in order to reveal the, quote, time sequence of layers, as well as a, quote, inventory of buried materials without destroying the mound. Egan's vertical shaft is cut between the exposed urns, and it partially obscures 2 of the exposed skeletons below. Within the shaft, a small pot rests next to a single human skeleton arranged in an upright fetal position. Its head, like those of the skeletons laid on their backs, is oriented to the left. The prominent elements of Egan's cross-section are echoed but reimagined in Hinton's photo collage, where Egan's layers remain perfectly level despite their age. Hinton's have settled and shifted. Similarly, where Egan depicts large clay urns, upright and unbroken, Hinton depicts a jumble of human remains and funerary objects in the base of her cross-section, and a golden-colored human head, a funeral mask perhaps, or a clay figure, lying on its side near the blue embryo in the layer or layers of soil above the interred ancestors. Most striking is how Ancestral Plane reimagined Egan's cut shaft and exposed skeleton arranged in an upright fetal position. The photo collage includes a thin black outline that suggests the embryo also sits, or perhaps floats, within a vertical shaft. In keeping with Hinton's overall aesthetic, and in contrast to the rigidly straight lines of Egan's shaft walls and floor, the black outline is wavy. The line's suggestion of movement that is sinuous is again suggestive of a more organic composition. This wavy line forms a protective container around the central figure of the electric blue embryo, which replaces the ivory-colored bones of Egan's adult skeleton. This substitution especially signals how, in contrast to Egan's static image, Hinton's mound functions as an active portal between worlds. Hinton's substitution of the blue embryo, positioned above the substitution of the glowing landscape bodies of interred ancestors, signals the mound's function as a womb for generating new indigenous life. Over the years of our collaboration, Choctaw writer Leanne Howe has regularly reminded the artistic team supporting the creation of Sideshow Freaks and Circus Engines, the performance piece she and Guna and Rappahannock playwright Monique Mojica are co-developing. That it's important, Leanne has told us, for us to travel. In the past, the ancestors moved from one earthworks complex to another for annual visits and special occasions, for important social and political events, for astronomical observations, for economic, artistic, and intellectual exchange. Especially relevant for our project, they traveled from mound to analyze structures and to consult with builders. Our inquiry, too, should be grounded in purposeful movement. It was in this spirit that, in May 2013, my Ohio State colleague Marty Chotsmith and I took Howe and Mojica to a group of relatively obscure burial mounds and geometric enclosures sited near the banks of the Scioto River. The mounds had only recently re-entered public discourse and become accessible to visitors. This detail is not insignificant. Native peoples have been cut off from their ancient and historic sites for generations, physically removed from their presence, denied access to their encoded knowledge, excluded from their upkeep and care. Since the 19th century, when they were first mapped, this group of mounds has been known as Holder Wright, although subsequent to our visit, the site was slated to be renamed Ferris Wright Park and Hopewell Earthworks. And it shouldn't be a surprise that all of these names, of course, acknowledge the settler families who dug, plowed, looted, or bulldozed the mounds toward partial destruction or full erasure, not their builders, original users, or subsequent caretakers. And although the site's location must have seemed remote to early non-native explorers and settlers, today Holder-Wright sits adjacent to the northwest arc of Interstate 270, Columbus, Ohio's multi-lane outer belt, about a mile from the center of Dublin, one of the small towns the interstate has transformed into Columbus suburbs. What remain of the 5 burial mounds and 3 geometric enclosures are available for viewing only because they happen to stand within what is now the area's last intact farmland. Homesteaded by Joseph Ferris in 1818, and the approximately 47 acres straddle a picturesque creek known as Wright's Run, notable for small waterfalls, limestone cliffs, and a system of caves. The creek flows west to join the nearby Scioto River, just south of a wide expanse of level shoreline that has been a major canoe access point for centuries, if not for millennia. Fortunately, this natural launch has been preserved as part of Scioto Park, where it now sits under the watchful gaze of a massive limestone monument erected in 1990, depicting the 18th and 19th century chief of the Wyandot, known to settlers as Leatherlips. The Scioto flows south through what is now downtown Columbus to eventually join the Ohio River. Holder-Wright was no lonely outpost, but rather an accessible node within a larger network. Although Ferris's descendants deeded this last section of, quote, undeveloped land to the city of Dublin with the stipulation that it become a public park, and thus protected the site from the asphalt and concrete of yet another subdivision, their contemporary act could not undo 2 centuries of active farming. Some of the mounds were plowed for generations. Others were completely or partially destroyed in the building of a frame house and other structures. Moreover, the mounds were repeatedly, quote, explored by curious settlers in the early and mid-19th century. Already disturbed, they were then subject to more systematic excavations by professional archaeologists, first in 1890, then in the 1920s, again in the 1960s, and more recently during field schools led by Ohio State faculty in 2013, 14, and 16. At the time of our visit, the earthwork that remained most physically conspicuous was a crescent-shaped embankment from what had once been a large circular enclosure. Damaged and diminished, the earthen ark nonetheless stood defiantly extant near the farmhouse. In an adjacent field, fallow and brown, darker outlines of what had once been a similarly large square embankment and the conical burial mound it enclosed were still visible on the turned soil, although only as faint traces. Our visit to Holder-Wright was facilitated by a well-informed Dublin City Parks Ranger who led us on a pleasant walking tour around the old house, silo, and outbuildings, through the fallow fields, and along accessible parts of the creek bank. He described what he knew of the site's history, including a tantalizing story of the discovery in one of the larger limestone caves of 6 complete skeletons of canines, the dogs apparently arranged as guardians, and what were then early plans for converting the defunct farm into an earthworks-themed historical park and interpretive center. Once the formal tour was complete, the ranger allowed us to spend additional time at the site. Howe and Mojica were now able to engage in embodied research and embodied improvisation. They walked the land again on their own, individually and together, without the ranger's directions or running commentary. After a time, each described feeling a distinctly female energy emanating from what remained of the square enclosure and its conical mound. And remarkably, while my colleague and I made polite conversation with the ranger, the researchers were able to gather a song from this part of the site that they will incorporate into their evolving performance. I photographed Howe and Mojica crouched low on what appeared to be barren ground as they recorded themselves singing the ancient song into a smartphone. The song, they later explained, had risen from the raised but still encoded earth to ride the wind skyward, traversing and thus linking the 3 worlds. They were certain the high-pitched song had been sung by a young girl. Howe subsequently began referring to the raised square and the trace of its enclosed burial as the little girl's mound. As at other sites where they have received song, Howe and Mojica's experience at Holder Wright confirmed a central indigenous understanding about the ongoing vitality of ancient earthworks. It is not only selected rocks and soils that were carefully layered in the building of these structures. Words were spoken and chanted, songs were sung, dances were danced into earth during the preparation of carefully chosen sites for construction, during the preparation of soils carefully selected and then carefully gathered as materials for building. Words were spoken and chanted, songs were sung, and dances were danced into earth once again during actual mound construction, during subsequent ceremony, during regular upkeep, maintenance, and renewal. In these ways, layers of packed rocks and soils were imbued with the power of sacred discourse, the energy of rhythmic movement. It is this communal power and energy that prepared the earth and helped build the mounds. It is this communal power and energy that continues to sustain their extant remains, their remnants, and traces. The image I made of Howe and Mojica singing upon the trace of the little girl's mound is difficult to translate into words. Simultaneously, the image describes an event of embodied research about performance, an event of embodied research and performance, an event of embodied research as performance. Neither the photograph I took nor the audio recording the researchers themselves produced, however, conveys the full complexity of this scene of embodied improvisation. Howe and Mojica crouched upon the repeatedly plowed earth, sang into the rising wind, and recorded their voices on a smartphone only a few feet in front of me, slightly to my left. But just behind me, to my right, stood the parks ranger who had guided our formal tour. And he was now explaining in detail how the site could become a public park, with walking trails and playground equipment, with rain gardens of indigenous plants and restored or even newly constructed earthworks, with the 1820 farmhouse converted into a state-of-the-art interpretive center. The Native women's impromptu performance made the ranger obviously uncomfortable. Although he did not comment explicitly on the women's unexpected actions unfolding before us, he continued to speak directly into my ear when first one and then the other caught the ancient rhythm, sought ground, and began to sing. As the women's separate voices united into one, the ranger's volume increased. His voice grew louder and then louder still as he continued to enumerate parks regulations and possibilities. Desecrated and nearly destroyed, the earthworks refused to remain silent. The little girl's mound offered its voice to those who would hear, but the ranger seemed unable to stop talking, even to lower his volume. I don't think he meant disrespect. His actions embodied the experience of a cognitive dissonance, of a physical disconnect from Earth that only moments before had seemed so familiar and under rational control, an asset to be managed. As the women crouched and sang, the sterile meets and bounds of the Dublin Plat map were receding before him, and new maps, layered from moist and fecund earth, were rising. For my part, in that moment of trying to remain polite without succumbing to the ranger's volume or vision, in that moment of trying to listen and see and remember, to record Howe's and Mojica's presence and actions in their fullness, I was caught in an embodied experience of my own. I stood literally between competing discourses and performances. It was a situation, I would realize only later, that is not unlike that of the mounds and enclosures at Holder Wright, or the myriad earthworks located along the waterways of central and southern Ohio, or spread across the eastern half of the North American continent. In all these places, what remains of ancient mounds stand caught between communal, gendered, and multidimensional indigenous performances on the one hand, and on the other, a patriarchal, non-native insistence, an authoritative settler monologue that seeks to overpower all other voices, all other visions and understandings, but cannot, at least not fully. Efforts to preserve, engage, research, appreciate, understand, and explain earthworks, and both their original and ongoing significance from Indigenous perspectives, continue to be similarly spoken over, similarly sidelined and devalued, often in similar terms, even, or perhaps especially, within the discourses of the dominant academy. Standard archaeological, anthropological, and historical narratives produced almost exclusively by non-native and predominantly male scholars continue to dominate authoritative discourses and continue to direct major funding for research and preservation. But despite these persistent impediments, we find ourselves in an extraordinary period of possibility. Earthwork seems suddenly to be on every Indigenous body's mind. Not only trained archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, park rangers and museum curators, but artists, writers, and performers, public intellectuals and activists, communities and nations, and their keepers of knowledge, story, and ceremony. In diverse works of art, in text and performances, and in built environments, knowledge-encoded Indigenous pasts is being reactivated in the present in order to rewrite Indigenous futures. These contemporary productions respond to dominant discourses, which typically code earthworks as silent, static, and dead, cut off from living Indigenous communities, by recoding earthworks as vital and alive, as articulate, generative, and in motion. They encode earthworks as sites not of stasis and death, but of ancient and ongoing energy. Hatak Okla, Hot Okchaya. Iliaho, Ilibilia. People ever living, ever dying, ever alive. Chokmashke, thank you.